Okay, it's about showtime.
All right, guys, please take out the card when you're ready, and we're going to get started. Good evening. Thank you all for joining us on this late or even later than expected time slot. We're glad you're here. This is the panel is the Impossible Action Adventure Comedy, which I think we're going to possibly discuss as not all that impossible. And what we're going to do is we have Lawrence Raphael Brothers, we have Jim C. Hines, Sarah Jean Horowitz, and Alex Schwartzman. My name is Randy Dawn. I will be your moderator. And what I think we will do first is, let's talk about, I'm going to mention the little blurb for the panel in case anybody has wandered in and isn't sure why they're here. The idea behind this panel is that while talking about Men in Black, the director Barry Sonnenfeld said, the concept of an action-adventure comedy is an oxymoron. Almost without fail, the comedy kills the reality of the action, or the action has to stop for some sort of funny line. If the action is too scary or gross or graphic, it kills the comedy. It's a very hard line. So we're going to explore to what extent this holds true for written work. We're not really going to talk necessarily about movies or TV. This is more about written work. And we want to talk about some examples about where this works. So why don't we start off with some introductions? Maybe start with, tell us who you are, and maybe if you can come up with a book or a story that had both action and was funny. Sarah, do you want to start things off?
Sure. My name is Sarah Jean Horowitz. I'm a fantasy author. I write primarily for a middle grade audience. My most recent book is called The Dark Lord Clementine, and it sort of combines a little bit of dark humor with fantasy for young readers. So I suppose a little bit of funny is why I'm here.
And did you
funny action spec fic. I'm basic, so Good Omens. It's one of my favorites.
You know, that's an easy one.
Yep.
Jim, you want to go next?
Sure. My name's Jim Hines. I've been writing for 20 some years. A couple of the books, there was a series about this little underdog, nearsighted goblin. I'm currently wrapping up a trilogy about space janitors. So again, humor, some action, some adventure. An example of a book that blends both. How about A Wizard's Guide to Defensive Baking by T. Kingfisher?
Excellent. Alex, how about you go next?
Hi, my name is Alex Schwartzman. I write and edit a lot of speculative fiction. My very first novel came out in 2019. It's decidedly unfunny, and it's called Iridine's Crown. But my next book coming out next year will be an action comedy. I'll talk about that when that's more details about that is announced. Until then, I would like to recommend an author who writes books that inspired mine and to which mine is somewhat similar and an homage to, and that's Simon R. Green. And he writes a lot of different humorous books that are packed with action. And for anybody who's trying out that sort of material from him, I would recommend starting with the Nightside series.
Okay. And
Can I?
Oh, I'm sorry, Jim, did you have
I was just going to, Alex, you've also edited some humorous anthologies, if I recall correctly.
Yeah. I didn't want to do too much self-promotion. I am the editor of the Unidentified Funny Object series of anthologies. We are currently at 8 books over 10 years. I've published a lot of great authors, including Jim, as well as all sorts of people from Neil Gaiman and George Martin to Esther Friesner and Jodie Lynn Knight. So I read a lot of humorous short stories or stories that think they're humorous because they're submitted to the anthology. So I have to really sit there and judge very harshly whether something is humor.
Okay. And Lawrence.
Okay, I'm a writer and a technologist. I published a whole bunch of short stories, some of which might conceivably be considered funny. I'm currently touting these romantic noir urban fantasies, which only have a little bit of comic relief and aren't all that funny in themselves. But I do write a certain amount of humor anyway from time to time. Just to call out a random action adventure comedy series, I particularly like Walter John Williams' Maestral, which may or may not be anything like how you pronounce it, series.
I'm so
I'll
glad
find
that you don't even know, because when you wrecked it earlier today on Twitter, I was like, yo, how do you say that?
Yes, Maijstral. I'll find a link to it and paste it in a moment. Anyway, so that's me, and I'll post to Discord some of this useful information about me.
Great, and we will
There
get
we
into more titles and authors a little bit later on and everything. So my name is Randy Dawn. I'm a journalist, entertainment journalist, and an author. My first book, my first novel is coming out next August, and it is a hopefully funny book called Tune In Tomorrow that mixes reality shows and mythical creatures. So and in terms of the book that I would say is a good example, I think Kill the Farm Boy did a really good job with it. That's Delilah Dawson and Kevin Hearn's book. So I really enjoyed that. That does mix both some action adventure and some funny. Right, so now when we're going back to the Sonnenfeld quote, he was talking about films. That's a different animal than speculative literature. We understand that. But do you think that, just to start off, do you think that it's easier or harder to maintain this action comedy balance in film or television than it would be in a book? And go ahead and just launch in, whoever wants to say something, and we'll go around.
So I think it's apples and oranges. I think it's equally easy to do it in both. I kind of hated that quote when I saw it in the panel description, and part of the reason I really wanted to be on the panel is to argue against it and take it down. I think that it's virtually impossible to have rising action throughout the story, whether it's in a written form or in a film. You have to have valves, and one of the best valves that you can have is comic relief. So, because you don't want to completely veer off into a different direction in the story, but you can have a funny interaction or just a bit of physical comedy, which is really easy to do in a film or a TV show, and suddenly you've released enough tension, then you can go back to doing the rising action thing. And so it makes it easier, not harder, to do the action part of the movie. And I think that that's true in books as well. It's just that we have to handle it in a very, very different manner. And I think that we'll probably be able to speak more to that later in the panel. Like, the techniques that we would use are often very different from the movies, especially since we can't do physical comedy in the same way.
Right, right.
Well, I guess a little, just to be a bit contrary, I was sympathetic to his idea. I just didn't think I thought he was too harsh, and severe about it. I just think it's a little challenging to have a lot of humor and strong action. Comic relief is one thing, a bit of humor or mild humorous content, but if you're going to have gut laughs, if you're going to have pratfalls, that does seem to me to have to be a challenge to mix into a compelling story with characters that you are really immersed with. That doesn't mean you can't do it, of course, in either film or in text. It's just that it's a bit more delicate to handle if there's, really strong humor.
Right, right.
It's a balancing act.
Yeah.
It's just like anything else. If your humor is too over the top or too ridiculous, it will break somebody out of the story, whether it's movie or prose. So yes, it can be difficult, but on the other hand, Princess Bride.
Right, right. So Sarah, did you want to chime in on that?
I also didn't really agree with the quote. I don't know. It just doesn't seem as hard as they made it out to be. I'm picturing that GIF of Elle Woods, and she's like, "What? It's hard?" Which sounds really shitty, but if you have an understanding of your own story and your pacing and stuff, then I don't know. I don't think it's that hard, because that quote had two parts, right? There was sort of part one, which was about humor interrupting action. And then there was part two, actually, which we haven't talked about at all, which was about violence and graphicness. Essentially, they were it can't be too violent or graphic or it's not funny. But
Deadpool.
obviously we've all seen like from, not we've all seen, but like some of us have seen like very funny graphic violence, like the infamous scene like from Dusk Till Dawn comes to mind, you know, the bar fight scene, which is very darkly funny and stuff like that. So I just like disagree with both with both sections of that quote.
Yeah.
And I also, because I think that like the part about sort of humor stopping the action, I think is even less relevant in books, because I mean, this sounds really dumb, but like people have to read words. Like you already need a lot of words to clearly describe action. So I don't think you're like stopping anything in its tracks by adding in some funny quips.
Yeah. I remember thinking it was a rather odd quote for somebody like Barry Sonnenfeld to say, because he clearly had figured out that it's not an oxymoron. Man in Black, for example. So I wanted to, but veering away from the actual content of the quote, just getting into the idea of mixing these two things in literature. I think, you know, I want to talk a little bit about tone, because that's obviously a hugely important factor in books, particularly if you're going to be mixing genres. How important is striking the right tone to both, you know, an action story and one that includes humor? And what do you think are ways to mix it up throughout the book? Or does it, you know, can it vary scene by scene? Does it have to be a straight one tone throughout the entire thing? Like, what do you think? What do you all think about that aspect of it? I'll call on you.
All right. Well, I think tone is very important for any kind of fiction, any kind of prose whatsoever, actually, even nonfiction. And it's a delicate balance to, I'm going to say that over and over again if somebody doesn't stop me, to mix different currents of different types of fiction together. Some people just have the ear for it and can do it, you know, beautifully and exquisitely. But at other times, you might see a sort of juncture point or a transition that is a little dismaying, you know, when you're reading fiction and you think this is entirely serious and the comic relief is too harsh, or you think this is really lighthearted, and then something drastic happens. It isn't funny at all. It's just terrible or horrifying, and you may really be jolted by that kind of transition. Now, that could also be an authorial choice, you know, to create a certain type of discord, as it were. But I do think that there's a lot of delicacy in the most subtle forms of prose and word choice and mot juste choices and that kind of thing to get it just right.
Right.
Whether you're writing a humor story or any other kind, we tend to establish a certain voice for a specific book. And when you write the next book, you might use a very different voice for that. So I think the tone of humor and the way that you intersperse humor into your story is related to that. So just to give an example, you know, the humor on something like The Good Place will be very, very different from, you know, humor on something like Guardians of the Galaxy, right? Because they're, you know, they have very different tones to them, and that drives the sort of jokes and the sort of funny things that you can do. You know, The Death of Stalin is a very funny movie, but it's so darkly funny and so wry, you know, that you can't really compare that exactly to slapstick comedy.
Right.
I really love your point about sort of voice and tone, like going hand in hand and one sort of dictating the other. Because I was actually having trouble like articulating my thoughts about tone and like tonal consistency as it pertains to humor, and like how you establish that in like a, you know, your humorous actiony book or whatever. But voice makes a lot more sense to me. And I don't really know why, but it just makes more sense to me, because that's like it's almost like the character behind, you know, it is the character behind the narration of the book almost, even if it's not a character, it is the character.
Right.
Kind of with tone and with voice, there's that question of what kind of story are you writing? You know, if you are writing a dark horror story, then both the action and the humor need to somehow fit into that dark horror.
Mhm.
If you're writing something lighter or more hopeful, that's the kind of humor and action you need. Just like, if I was writing a lighter book, I'm probably not going to have horrible graphic violence, probably not going to have horrible graphic humor either.
Right, right.
And
So
there
by
are
the way-
ways to, oh, sorry, go ahead, Randy.
No, go right ahead.
I was just gonna say there are kind of ways to like work around that too, in terms of like how vague the narration is, or like how
Yeah.
it's sort of like as a children's author who sometimes has to include like very violent things. Too. Like there are ways of like implying like that whole village over there got murdered by monsters, without actually going to the village and seeing everyone get murdered by monsters. So that's a tool. That's like a tool in your toolbox too that you can use to maintain your tone and keep your audience as you kind of shield them from some of the scarier bits.
That happened between the pages.
Yeah. But I think that's a good point too. I mean, something can be made funny even if it is objectively horrible with some distance, depending on how it fits into the book. I wanted to just quickly mention, by the way, to our attendees here, that we are going to take your questions in the last like about 10 minutes of the chat. So please feel free to send them in. We are getting them, and I'm going to go through them toward the end of this panel. So, we talked a little bit about, how you do this if you want to have some violence, if you want to have something really actiony. How do you suppose that some books or some stories can work in that, like a death of a character, and yet the rest of the book is funny? I mean, what are some ways that you think that has been done effectively?
So in Stardust, there's like this whole plot line about all these brothers of this deceased king who are fighting each other to be the next king. And like, I mean, minor spoilers, the concept is introduced in the first page that they're introduced. Basically, they all have to kill each other like Hunger Games style to see who will become the next king. And like the book is fundamentally funny, but it's also about like a bunch of brothers killing each other and trying to assassinate each other. And yet he sort of offsets the horror of this by having the ghosts of all the already killed brothers be like hanging around and commentating on the action. which is really funny. And so it's just like something to balance that darkness. And of course, again, we're not going into like the super graphic detail you might go into in a darker book. There's something still very, and like, because it's kind of generic and there's that distance that you mentioned, like not generic, but like there is distance and it's kind of like fabular and, fairy tale like, that also keeps a little bit of the graphicness at bay and still keeps it funny.
Sure. Do you guys have any other examples?
I'm thinking about Richard Kadri, if that's how you pronounce his name, and the Sandman Slim novels right now. I don't have a conclusion to draw, but he has a very deft hand at mixing extreme violence and horror elements with humor. And he doesn't do it necessarily by silifying, if that's a word, the action. The characters care about what's going on in their story and in their world, even though sometimes the action is a little on the ridiculous or over the top side. It's extreme, but nevertheless, you just, as a reader, you're not traumatized by it the way you might be by a much more serious work with much less violence. So I'm not quite sure how he does it, but or what the technique is. But it's certainly an example anyway.
Yeah.
The Discord is scooping the example I was going to bring up. Terry Pratchett, the latest one that I read is Night Watch. It's one of the Guards books. And it's Terry Pratchett. So it's funny, it's satirical. It's got lots of humor and some absurdity and some poking at tropes. And in the meantime, it's taking on police violence and police corruption, and people die, and there's rioting in the city, and it's horrible. And Pratchett has this ability to show us these horrible things and do it in an honest way, and to show us the absurdity of it. I'm going to write this in a way that you'll laugh so that you don't cry.
Mm-hmm.
And it is funny, and it is powerful. And I swear someday I want to learn how to do that.
Well, right up in the, and I know that we said we'd take questions at the end, but people are coming up with good ideas. Somebody mentioned about Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. I'm sort of wondering, not to veer this into too much of a niche, but Pratchett, Gaiman, Adams, those are all British writers. I'm wondering, do the Brits have maybe a finer tuned sensibility of mixing these two things than perhaps American authors do? Because I'm wondering if you think that there's something culturally that works better that they do.
Well, there's definitely a cultural difference to British humor versus American humor. There's some characteristic wryness. I'm not sure that much as I love Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, I'm not sure I consider that the greatest example of blending these two genres, because I think it's so much, there's so much focus on the comic part that for me, in long passages in those books at least, I stopped caring about what happens to the characters. If they could live or die or explode or turn into whales or whatever, and it really wouldn't matter that much to me because I'm in it for the next episode. And because it was originally an episodic humor radio cast, I think some of that shines through where it might not in his more serious mixes of humor and drama, like what's his name? The absurd detective.
Dirk Gently.
Dirk Gently, yes.
So what about everybody else?
I think Lawrence actually just underscored the point that I wanted to make to your previous question. And that is that it's really important to know that when working on the humor book, when reading the humor book, you shouldn't expect every single page and every single interaction in it to be funny. It'll get tedious really quickly, even if it's done by a true master like Adams or Pratchett. That's why they have those moments where it's not necessarily just humor. There's reflection, there's some more serious moments, there's darker moments. And if you don't have those, if you don't mix it up, however much humor you wish to inject into your book, some of it's going to have 90% humor and 10% action, and some of it's going to be, the flip of that. But you have to mix it up or it doesn't work.
Absolutely.
Right.
You need that balance. Otherwise, you're just doing a routine.
Right. I think it's a bit like, it's a recipe. There are some that use more sugar and some that use less sugar. And in the case of Hitchhikers, there is plenty of adventure going on. You can argue how much of it is action, but it is a lot of adventure. But the big leavening agent is the humor, whereas other books might flip that around. Action. One thing that strikes me is that action adventure, as we often see it, particularly when it's portrayed on the screen, it traditionally is very muscular and done in these broad swipes, Indiana Jones type stuff, and really takes itself seriously. Do you think that it's important to have some humor somewhere in there to deflate that balloon a bit?
Yes.
Short answer, yes. I don't think I've ever written anything in a even moderately long form that doesn't have some kind of comic relief, and even if it's meant to essentially to be serious.
Right.
I was thinking about this in terms of this panel because I was thinking about if I actually like comedy or not. Because the thing is I was thinking about just my own preferences, and I realized I like things that are funny, that have humor in them, but I'm not sure if I like things that are explicitly intended to be comedies.
Yeah.
So Lawrence, you were saying before, I'm also not the biggest fan of Hitchhikers. It just doesn't do it for me. I think it's too funny. That sounds ridiculous. I'm in
Yeah.
the wrong panel. Kick me out now. Just mute me. Randy, I'm gone. But I think, you know, what you were talking about before about like, what's the leavening agent? How much do you have of, you know, part seriousness, part connection with the characters and part humor, etc. For me, it's like, I like something that's a little lighter on the pratfalls and stuff.
This leads to a question I wanted to bring, a point I wanted to bring up: the difference between, you know, a humorous story and a funny story, and you know what works at different lengths and so on. So, you know, I like humorous stuff at length, you know. So a long humorous novel is great as far as I'm concerned, whether it's from Mark Twain or Martha Wells or whoever, you know, or Connie Willis, or, you know, a really funny thing. A really hilarious thing is going to be a short episode, and it could be a short episode in a longer work, which isn't all that funny, as Alex pointed out, or it could just be a short story whose only point is to deliver that one laugh, you know. But a long work which is just laden with funny, I'm not sure I like that as much.
Do you know why?
I don't know why. It has something to do with the willingness to immerse myself in a longer work, is connected to some sense of, some even fragile sense of reality that the author is providing, and too many gut laughs break that for me. And that's, you know, back to Sonnenfeld's point, I guess. So, like, you know, with Discworld and Pratchett, who everybody loves, and we can talk about it forever if we wanted to, I prefer the guard stories, you know, to Rincewind, or to the silly or modern thing in the fantasy world stories, although there are a couple of those that I actually do like, so that's not true. But anyway, you know, the more plot and drama and character, most importantly, the better for me as far as humor goes.
Right.
Well, for me, one of the dangers and one of the problems I see sometimes is with humor. It's very easy to try too hard. And I've read it in workshops, I've read it in published works sometimes, where it feels like the author is just trying too hard for that joke. They're pushing too hard for the laugh. And if it feels at all forced, it boots you out of the story.
Because it's like, it's story, not stand up. Right?
Yes. Yes.
Like we
Yeah.
made a joke earlier about how it's a good thing we're all writers, because you know, we certainly wouldn't make it as stand-up comedians or improv comedians, because we need time to think about our jokes. And I think a little bit of what you're getting at is that the story and the integrity of the story needs to come first before you're hitting jokes. Because if you're just hitting jokes and you're just aiming for jokes, then it's going to be too much. It's going to feel forced, or it's going to fall flat.
Right.
A, B, or C, or all of the above.
Right.
And this is very different from a comics or stand-up routine. I mean, I could stand for 40 minutes of George Carlin, or, you know, anybody doing really groundbreaking new humor. That would have been George Carlin in 1970, but, you know. Whereas the equivalent of 400 pages of that, I mean, that would blow your head off.
And I think that this connects to your point earlier about like funny versus humorous, because like the thing about a stand-up routine is it's usually sort of constructed as a series of vignettes or anecdotes. And so you were kind of saying how like you can handle really funny stuff in smaller doses, but when you get to like a larger, like a 400-page book, you would much rather prefer like an overall humorous tone as opposed to belly laughs on every page. And I think that sort of connects back to that a little bit.
So I'm actually consistent on that.
One of the
In the perfect world, when you're structuring your story and when you're writing the plot, I think the best thing to do is, if you can, is to plan for the eventuality that you're gonna have a reader for whom every single one of your joke fails. And if you did your job right, the plot will carry them through. So if the plot is interesting enough on its own and the humor is a bonus, I think that's the best sort of formula. I mean, it's not always the case. You know, sometimes you are heavier on humor, but that's what when I'm writing, that's what I strive for. I don't always succeed, God knows, but that's the goal is to always have a strong enough plot where even if the humor fails, you have a backup.
Right.
That is
right.
such good advice. That just like shook me to my core. My pulse is racing. My writing is forever changed. No, seriously, it's really good advice. Like, assume that every joke you write will fail. Like, someone will hate it. And like, does your story still work? Is, I think, it's obviously not like, doesn't apply to everything. Like no advice applies to everything, but I think that's like really good advice.
I think we should pay a fee for that.
Not fair. You know,
Most people did.
first-
They registered for this convention.
That's right. Exactly.
First, Alex shows up with the puppy. Now he's throwing out the world-changing advice.
So a little diversion here. In our sort of our pre-panel emailing that we went back and forth, Sarah brought up a book. I'm going to mangle this name, so I apologize. Like Kwame Mbalia's Tristan Strong, which is action adventure, uses a humorous narrative to get into these traumatic subjects. And that reminded me, for example, of another book, Good Lord Bird, which is like, it's kind of an alternate universe. So technically, I think it counts as spec fic. But it's told through the eyes of this young child, which allows for humor to come into these really difficult moments. And I'm wondering, what do you think about humor as kind of this Trojan horse for that kind of material?
Yes, definitely. And it's something one of the questions that came up was about structure with humor too. And for me, I love using humor to address darker subjects. And there are so many ways to do it. One of them, the contrast between the humor and the darker stuff can make both of those more powerful. And I hate using this as an example because it's film and he's problematic, but Joss Whedon has done this extremely well, where he will combine the humor and the trauma, and both of them hit you that much harder for the contrast. And it also feels very human. We use humor to cope with the horrific. A friend of mine died in a car accident at 16, and the rest of us hung out that night. We're down in the basement, we're eating nachos, we're grieving, but we're also telling all of these jokes and laughing, and it's a coping mechanism. It's very human. It's one of the reasons that if I read a book and there's no humor anywhere, I can't even believe that. It's not realistic or plausible anymore.
Yeah.
Right, absolutely. Anybody else want to jump in on that one?
I mean, I guess I can expand just a little bit about the Tristan Strong series that I mentioned in the email. So that is a series by Kwame Mbalia. And the thing that I find so masterful about that series is that it is an action adventure book, and that it's incorporating all these fun elements of both like African American and a little bit, I believe it's West African mythology and folk heroes and stuff. And so it's got like this super fun narrator and super humorous voice and all these folk heroes and all this action. But what it's also doing is introducing the reader to like the history of the slave trade and the concept of generational trauma. But it's kind of doing this at the same time as you're on this really rollicking adventure. And I believe it was Alex who said this before, a little bit about humor providing like the respite or the reprieve and stuff. And so I think it's both sort of a vehicle for introducing tougher subjects, and it's that little bit of a break that you need to sit and digest everything.
Yeah.
Well said, certainly. So I thought we would go, I want to go and look at, we have a couple of questions that I thought we would address really quick, and then we'll sort of wrap things up with whether things you might want to talk about, and also any other authors or titles you might want to throw out there. From the questions about Murderbot, isn't the Murderbot series by Martha Wells the best current example of this wonderful but difficult subgenre? Whether or not it's the best, what do we think that we're seeing that Martha does with Murderbot that maybe is fresh or original or different in terms of marrying these two genres?
I think, and we talked about it earlier in the panel, it comes down to voice. Murderbot as a character has such a unique voice and is such a perfect sort of individual for our times, and his relationship with popular culture and sort of his Pinocchio, like I kind of want to be a real boy but not really thing. All of that works really well together, and I think that it's the fact that all of those elements are so well balanced that make. And I haven't read the novel that came out, but I have read the novellas, and I think that to me that's what makes that's what makes those stories work really, really well, and they deserve all the praise that has been heaped upon them in the years.
Speaking of the novel, compared to the others, though, it's a mystery, So Murderbot has a noir style voice. I wouldn't say noir per se, because that implies nihilism or existentialism in the underlying philosophy. But he has it has the voice of a PI from a noir film or novel, and when you see how perfectly Murderbot functions as an informal detective in this novel, it really illuminates what's going on with that character. But yes, the balance is exquisite there.
Excellent. So let's go to another question over here. Sorry, I got a little bit of scrolling going on. Can the panel discuss different purposes of comedy within an action context? Reader relief, jolt the reader's comfort zone, social commentary, character growth, etc. I sort of feel like we have touched on a lot of that stuff. Is there anything else that we didn't get to that you guys wanted to talk about in those particular categories?
I think one thing that may not have been covered yet is using it to help develop setting. And this is especially true in stories that may take place outside of what's cultural norms for the readers. So international fiction, fiction that takes place in marginalized communities, like the books that Sarah was talking about. You can use a lot of humor, and you can actually showcase some of the cultural humor there. So if I'm writing a book that's set in the shtetl, in the Jewish ghetto settlements in the 19th century, I can draw heavily on the humor and the jokes and the anecdotes from that culture, which are available to us from the writers like Shalom Aleichem and others that were writing at that time. And not only will I benefit from the much more brilliant jokes that they may have come up with, but it'll help set up the atmosphere of what I'm writing about as well.
Right. Okay.
I
So there's another question. No, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Okay. Humor can also work really well for character and relationship development.
Mm-hmm.
When you want to show who the character is, when you want to make the character likable, and then getting two characters who can actually banter together. If you do it well, that's pretty hot.
Yes.
Love me some enemies to lovers and some witty banter.
Yeah, I haven't been thinking about humor analytically when I actually write. I tend to just sort of let it emerge from time to time when it feels right. But I think it can have the tactical use of subversion, which you can. So when you subvert an expectation or subvert a trope or subvert a theme, or deconstruct if you prefer, humor can provide that little jolt, that disrupts or breaks the reader expectation or the assumption. So that's a tactical function, within the overall action adventure. So if you are trying to, let us say, switch to a sympathetic villain from an apparently monstrous one, then that humor could signal that transition.
Right, right. So another question, I'm not really sure I'm fully understanding this, but I'll read it aloud. Maybe I'm missing something. There's a lot of discussion of humor at the level of voice or tone as comic relief. What about humor as part of structure, action, adventure, or otherwise? Any examples? Are you guys able to parse what's sort of being asked here?
Parse it, but not understand it.
I can actually think of a good example, I think, for that. So there's a book that was actually only recently published in English, a translation from German. And the book is called Quality Land by Mark Uwe Kling. And the whole book, so the book is satire, and it's a satire of our present day sort of culture that's becoming like sort of over, with corporations taking over and with all the modern anxieties that we're having. And the structure of the book, the way that it's done, it's kind of difficult to describe in a brief statement on the panel. But if that question makes sense to you, check out a sample from that book. I think you can read like the opening pages for free on Amazon. It really makes sense. And another similar type of humor to that would be Silicon Valley. So if you ever watched Silicon Valley, the show, the way that structure is, and the way that it skewers that particular culture, I think works really well, and so embedded in the culture, in the idea and the concept of the show, that it wouldn't work without it.
Okay. Does somebody else want to jump in on that? We've got about 10 minutes left. I've got a couple more questions, and then I want to just wrap things up. But did you guys want to continue responding to that? Okay. Here's another question. Do you think that one character with a humorous voice who carries the humor in a book that is otherwise action adventure works well when the other characters are not humorous? Thinking about Gideon the Ninth by Tamsin Muir. And then, I'm sorry, it seems to continue also. I wonder if the conversation is unintentionally defaulting to hero's journey style action adventure. For example, Gail Carriger's books structured around heroine's journey would also fit.
Well, I don't know. I don't know about the latter. I thought that in Tamsin Muir's book there were multiple humorous characters, many of them, in fact. Although there's some brutal and ghastly action, especially in the second one. But I think the Falstaff is the classic example of the humorous character who, I guess you can view him as tragic eventually, but who is sort of showing up the otherwise serious and even glum characters around him. I think this is the deliberate auctorial decision to have a clash of tone as opposed to blending tone is what you see in that case.
Mm-hmm.
And the reasons for it are too deep for me, but I can recognize when it works.
Do you think though that are we talking about only hero's journey? Do we feel like the heroine's journey would be different in terms of humor, action, adventure? I'm not sure that I do, but maybe you guys might see this.
Well, I was thinking hero's journey versus other forms.
Yeah, I was thinking like the story arc as opposed to.
Well, I think humor in general, humor varies culturally. There's white middle-class American humor is going to be different from British humor we've talked about, which might be different from more female-centered humor, which might be different from it's past 10 o'clock, so my brain's starting to lose words. But I think one of the things the author needs to do is to step back and consciously recognize, what style of humor do I have? Where is this coming from? Is my humor punching up? Is it punching down? Is it centering this heroic, prototypical white male hero's journey person? Is it undermining that trope? Again, Pratchett. And just looking at, it's not, I wouldn't think of it so much as defaulting to hero's journey style, but more questioning, where does your humor come from? What does it reinforce? What does it challenge? Because humor is powerful. Humor is very often a weapon. Where are you aiming that?
Right, right. That's good. So we have about just over 5 minutes left. So we have one more question that's come in. I'm going to throw it out there, and then we'll go back to all of you for final thoughts. This is a question on process. Do you add more humor afterward, or do you write it as you go along?
Yes.
Both.
Okay.
I usually write it as I go along, but I have this thing I do when I'm blocked or feeling resistance, which is to write very plodding prose just to get through a section. And then I'll go back and fix that up to be actually interesting if I don't cut it. And one of the ways of fixing it up to be interesting is sprinkling in some humor. But I don't, generally speaking, go back to a story and insert humor just for the sake of inserting humor.
Right.
I'll insert humor if a joke occurs to me after the fact that fits particularly well. But usually it's sort of an integral part of what I'm writing. If it's a story that has a lot of humor, then it's going to have it immediately. I'm not going to just like go back and go like, oh, how do I make this funnier? Because then it'll be forced, and that's what Jim talked about earlier. You never want it to feel forced.
Right.
But at the same time, kind of like Sarah was saying, we're not stand-up comics because we need time. And if I'm working on a book, I'm slow. I need a year. And over the course of the year, you get those moments. It's like when you had the argument, and then at 2 a.m, I should have said this. You get that with the book, but you can go and you can put it in, and you can be that clever, funny, right, that quick responding person that we just can't be in real life.
But that's what I mean. Is when then something really brilliant comes to you after the fact, you put it in, but you don't probably sit there on a page and go, all right, I have to add 2 more jokes to this chapter or my job is not done.
Right.
Not really, no.
I imagine that on some level, there's also a bit of reining in sometimes. It's like, oh, I've gone completely hog wild with this.
Yeah.
A little bit.
That a joke is a kind of a
out, then add it in, I think, maybe. Go ahead. Okay, so yeah, I mean, we're very short on time right now. Everybody in the audience, if you would like to continue this conversation, we can join you on Discord in hallway chat 1 after we've wrapped up. But before we wrap up, everybody, you got one more thought or something you want to throw in here that we didn't get to, a book or a story you want to mention?
I'll rec something really quick. I'll also pop it in the Discord. I would like to rec the book Afro Puffs Are the Antennae of the Universe by Zigzag Claiborne, which is a book about a bunch of awesome ladies who accidentally get their hands on an AI and destroy capitalism. Okay, bye.
Anything else, you guys?
I'd like to plug Terminal Alliance by Jim Hines, which I found to be wonderful and I really enjoyed. And I think it's a perfect example of the action comedy mix that we are talking about in this panel. So if you like space opera that's funny and dark at times and has lots of like little epistolary asides, it's a book for you.
Okay. Your check is in the mail, Ellen. Jim or Lawrence, did you have any other final thoughts before we say goodbye and head over to Discord?
No, I guess I'd just like to make sure that if anybody out there is so benighted as not to have read P.G. Wodehouse, I mean, he's the most, in my opinion, consistently humorous writer of all time. Somehow he could just write. He could write a novel with laughs in it throughout, or at least smiles throughout. without it palling or getting old. I don't know how he did it, but there's technique there to study anyway.
Sure. Sure.
Just
Yeah,
you know, throw out from the writing side of it, if you want to write humor, if you want to write action, adventure, comedy, humor is like anything else. Practice. You know, there's this myth that you're either funny or you're not, but at least to some extent, you can practice humor. You can learn. You can get better at it. If that's something you want to do in your writing, work on it.
excellent. Well, this has been so good, you guys. We are like practically almost totally out of time here. Thank you, everybody, for coming. Thank you for everybody for listening to us. And we will see you over in Discord, and have a great Readercon.
Thank you for
Bye,
moderating.
everybody.